I want to ask you just a few questions now, specifically about a project of radical transformation to the continent's political economy. And you've already given some idea of that. But how do you envisage a transformation on the continent taking place? What's the relationship between sort of work that you do in Third World Network and the participation of activists and social movements?
The work that we do offers an analytical contribution because if you look at Africa currently, 30 or so, 20 or so years of political liberalization has given space for much freer expression than was the case before. But people are beginning to see the limits of the electoral carousel, among the elite, because in terms of actual policy choices that transform their lives, there's very little to choose among the parties. On the other hand, day to day, the choices, policy choices which are being made and are being implemented by the ruling elite, irrespective of which party they are in, are basically deepening and re-legitimizing the consequences of years of structural adjustment. So joblessness is very widespread. Inequality is very widespread. You have this huge youth unemployment, okay? And in the countryside, the expansion of large-scale agriculture is dispossessing people. Manufacturing has collapsed. So people have, and what would be standard public goods are increasingly being handed over, for private profit. In the first wave of privatization, we saw the obvious kind of assets of the real economy in agriculture and manufacturing, being sold off. Now, you're getting more insidious forms of privatization in terms of public-private partnerships, which are basically transforming remaining public goods into private goods, which are in the market. So there's a lot of protest about what is happening. And but all this is side by side with the celebration of Africa Rising. Africa Rising, which actually within it also has serious kind of deepening of class differentiation and inequality. And Africa Rising, which focuses on the headline story of per capita GDP growth, doesn't tell us anything about the quality of what is happening. And Africa Rising, where the structure of Africa's economies and also their place in the International Division of Labor is significantly, unchanged. So the agenda of radical political economy really has to take off from this reality about who are the people who are basically being increasingly oppressed and disadvantaged by this reality, which is masked by a celebration of Africa Rising. Because there's a growing recognition that this model is unsustainable across the political spectrum. So everybody talks about the need for structural transformation. But within that convergence, a very important difference about what this will mean. Do you want a vision of transformation which basically is saying let us tweak the model of neoliberal globalization and Africa's insertion a little bit by what is called inclusive growth, where you focus on eliminating extreme poverty and reducing inequality without any fundamental challenge really to the overall nature of class relations, and so on and so forth. Two, an agenda which says actually we need to break the way in which economies are organized. We need to create some autonomy, for processes, in Africa, not to be driven primarily by global capital. That whole arena is there as something which currently is a very key frontier, for intellectual ideological struggle and also contestation, which must be of interest, to people on the left.
And finally, based in Ghana, the country is a celebrated darling of this structural transformation that you mentioned and the so-called long boom. Can you discuss some of the battles that activists have faced in contesting that, the illusion of that boom?
I saw an article on the Rope website which described Ghana as the star of inequality. I thought that was a brilliant title because it captures very clearly, the reality that we have. I mean, if you look at Ghana, in a certain sense, it's celebrated for a very narrow set of factors. I mean, the fact that we've had elections without degeneration into violence and chaos. Now that's important. It's relatively free compared to other places. I mean, we can speak, like most citizens, they can go on radio and say what happens with about whoever is in power. But the important thing is that it doesn't change very much unless you're able to exert pressure, for change. Now the country is dependent on 3 raw material exports. So in that sense, actually, it's a microcosm for many countries. Oil, gold, and cocoa. And all these, particularly the oil and gold, have become the target of a lot of questioning because these are non-renewable natural resources. A strategy which is focused on revenue, at the very least, should optimize revenue. But the management of the resources has become caught up in the larger mismanagement, of the economy, the short-termism, which prioritizes the interests of foreign capital. I mean, Third Network Africa at the moment, we are engaged in a challenge against an agreement that the government signed with Goldfields of South Africa, cutting the taxes to Goldfields, supposedly in exchange for them to make new investments. The preliminary information, which has been put out by Goldfields itself, points to the fact that that agreement is illegal in terms of the relevant laws in Ghana. We are fighting to have the agreement disclosed, although we reserve our options in terms of what else we'll do to make sure, that this agreement, if need be, is abrogated. But it's just an aspect of the fact that, the transactions in all blocks and so on are all shrouded in secrecy. So the celebrated Ghanaian democracy, actually, at the heart of it, is secrecy and non-accountability in the management of the most important economic assets of the country. Now that gets lost in talking about the electoral carousel, of the elite. The mismanagement of the economy leaves a lot to be desired, to put it mildly. And it's not creating jobs. It's not creating opportunities. Okay? So those who are celebrating only because the elite can circulate power among themselves are missing the fact that actually a very large percentage of the population, even though they are the ones who vote, are being excluded from how power is used in that country.
Very briefly, could you say something about the political traditions in Ghana? Ghana, of course, was a champion with Kwame Nkrumah leading a radical African independence. Speaking of African socialism, a project that for a time seemed to animate the continent, playing the role for other national liberation movements. How has that legacy both inspired and perhaps also crippled the movements that have emerged subsequently in Ghana? How do you see that development?
I mean, Nkrumah's legacy overall, I think, has been positive in terms of, in his time, I think it was Cabral who said Nkrumah was the genius of the struggle against classical colonialism, and I think emphasis on the word classical. Although Nkrumah in his own last years came to trying to struggle to understand, neocolonialism, as an aspect of imperialism. But a lot of people who are looking for alternatives in the Ghanaian context, electoral political alternatives, point to Nkrumah's legacy. People point to Nkrumah's legacy in terms of what he tried to do to transform the economy, and to build kind of welfare state and so on. So when people talk about what standard Ghanaian leaders could attain, Nkrumah represents the person who was most ambitious and attained most, in his time, and of course also supported by extensive, writing of his own views and perspectives. The tradition also of anti-imperialism and support for national liberation remain a very strong part of his legacy, which was important for the country continuing to support movements across the continent. The other dimension of the Nkrumah legacy, which one could consider maybe to be a constraint, is that, it's because of the authoritarian dimensions of Nkrumah's rule in Ghana. It's easy for opponents of Nkrumah to highlight that and say, this guy, whatever he said, he was a tyrant, But so in the domestic, discussion, that is some aspect. But from a kind of a progressive, trying to build a progressive constituency in Ghana today, it's very clear that whilst Nkrumah's ideas of anti-imperialism remain relevant, the nature of imperialism has changed. The forms that it's taking. Okay. Increasingly, these things are taking the form of treaty relations. Okay. The nation state as a single unit is no longer the only arena, within which, these pressures are emerging. Nkrumah himself, of course, recognized the need to work beyond the nation state. He was not very successful in getting that kind of momentum. But his ideas about working, around the Pan-African level remain very, very relevant. What I think, however, was a weakness in this thing was that it was very focused on leaders at the top. Okay, whilst his own project of coming to power being very much mass-based, his Pan-African thing didn't pay enough attention to the dimension of mass politics. And I think if his legacy, the positive elements has to be built on this dimension, of the mass organization and consciousness, it's a critical, valuable addition.
Thank you very much, Comrade, for speaking to rope.net.